Alrighty, y'all. I am going to get us kicked off. So hopefully y'all can see me on this live stream. So thank you for tuning in if you're here attending virtually. Thank you if you came out in person. Thank you so much. Help yourself to some food, whatever. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about best practices deploying to Kubernetes. Our friend Fernando from Armory is here to talk about some of the things he's seen in supporting large-scale customers, as well as just general best practices when deploying to Kubernetes, which is awesome. So a little bit of business. It's already right on the wall, but if you need to connect to the Wi-Fi, it's right there. It's also here presented. Don't worry, it's over there as well. And if you can't connect, just feel free to reach out to me. If you're not already, follow us on Twitter. We don't spam too much other than our events. So check us out on our events here. There's one Twitter handle for GDG Chicago, but there's 2 meetup groups. So however you want to get connected with us, by all means, feel free to connect, retweet, tag us, share pictures, whatever. Just some order of business, just to get, as we're kind of transitioning back into events. It's been a while since we've kind of had this slide, but it's more important that we start talking about this as just a general code of conduct, whether you're joining us virtually, whether you're joining us in person. We have a general code of conduct, and it's pretty simple. There's a lot more to it, but in general, it's summed up as be excellent to one another. We're all here to learn, grow, be great to one another, right? And if you see something, say something. If you're not comfortable, find me, find one of my other organizers, pull us aside. There's no harm in that. We're here for y'all as a community. Even online in chat, you have our email as well. You have us, you can email us, you message us directly if there's any sort of harassment, which is, again, harassment will not be tolerated. We're open and welcoming community. So be nice to one another and, just be awesome to one another. And the last one is just kind of practice saying yes and. So giving an update like, oh, yes and. Like, yes and what else? Don't try to start with, no, that's not the right thing. Say, well, yes, and did you know? Or like, yes, and you can also, right? Don't start with the negatives. Think about how we can collaborate. Again, community. We're here for one another, to learn and grow from one another. Giving a shout out that Google I/O was announced formally. It'll be on May 10th, 2023. So be sure to sign up. If you are in the land of web, you do some Android development, even some cloud stuff. It does quite a bit. They do a pretty cool virtual experience every year too. They have like a little game. I don't know if they're going to do it this year, but last year they had like a whole little virtual I/O thing. Feel free to tune into that. Recommend you sign up. It's a free event online, so you can watch all the live streams, get some content. So by all means, check it out. With that, I want to give it to Fernando. Do you want to talk a little bit of just Armory and general and stuff? And I won't need the mic back to close out. Just figure out how you want to connect.
Sure.
Sorry, little tech handoff here.
Oh, it's all good. Well, thanks everybody for coming out, both in person and online. We're Armory. We're a continuous deployment company. We help customers unlock the next level of innovation for your continuous deployment strategy. So anything from small teams that are trying to get started, trying to adopt continuous deployment practices, all the way up to large-scale organizations. We have some customers that are deploying across 8,000 clusters in 8 different regions around the world. So truly, at any scale. A lot of the tooling that we build, some of it is open core, some of it is hosted, software as a service type stuff that helps you choose the right tool. And we'll certainly see how some of the strategies that we talk about today in a little bit play into that. But yeah, thanks for having us, Joel.
Yeah, thank you. Little handoff. I want to thank the Aspen Group for hosting us in person today. In a world of venues and post-COVID world, we're trying to figure out how to do these events and get everyone engaged. I know a lot of folks. We have some friends from New York joining us today. Some folks virtually joining us. The weather is also raining out there, so it may bundle up and be cozy at home, I guess, too. It's also not too bad. So we want to make sure that this event reaches you wherever you are. We hope everyone's doing well. But thank you so much for the Aspen Group for hosting us today in person. We do some cool things in terms of healthcare. Check out our tech blog there where we talk about how to secure Spinnaker if you use Spinnaker. So with that being said, we are going to do a little tech handoff here. We're going to connect to our presenter's laptop. So if you're here for best practices deploying to Kubernetes, you are in the right spot. Give a warm round of applause for Fernando. Thank you, Fernando.
It's a little quiet too. Sweet.
We're live.
All right, we're live. All right, welcome everyone. We're going to talk about deployment best practices in Kubernetes. If you saw the slide notes just now, it is a small lie. Best practices is a really broad generalization, right? The truth is a best practice for your organization is not necessarily going to be a best practice for mine. So what we're going to talk about today is a whole bunch of different styles of deploying to Kubernetes, and then we'll kind of talk about what makes sense for what sizes of organizations, what tools make sense, at what point you want to start thinking about different tools to help you deploy. So I'm going to start off by telling you who I am. You can see me here. I guess this is more for the folks online, or maybe you can see me on that little phone there. I'm an engineering manager at Armory. I've been working in the DevOps space, observability space, platform engineering for close to a decade now. Anything really in the last 10 years, experimental or not, is probably something that I've touched. I really enjoyed doing it at Fortune 100 companies, and then I decided I wanted to do it for more than a single customer at a time. So I joined Armory, get to work with a wide range of folks, super exciting stuff. And like I mentioned a moment ago, we do a lot of work with a broad range of customers. So in order to scope the content for today, I have a series of questions, and I'm going to rely on our moderator here, Joel, to answer some of the ones that are coming from online. So are folks in the room deploying to Kubernetes today? I'm going to start there. Yes, we've got one. Okay, 2, 3, nice. Okay, how about online? Do we have folks deploying to Kubernetes online?
There's 2 chats. 1 second.
Oh, there's 2 chats.
Water Community says welcome. And hold on. There's another chat here somewhere.
Excellent.
I don't see anyone just yet.
Okay, that's okay. All right, well, if you see them, let me know. Our next question is, are you building or consuming platform tooling? So are you the team that's providing Kubernetes, or are you a team that's deploying to Kubernetes right now? For those of you that were raising your hands. You are.
Okay.
Nice. Excellent. Okay. And then the third question, roughly how large are we talking here? Are we talking like tens of developers? Are we talking hundreds, thousands? Maybe raise your hand if you're like tens of developers. Hundreds? Hundreds-ish? Okay, ish. And how about thousands or more?
How many people are using the tooling we're doing? Or how many people?
Roughly.
Oh,
Yeah, about that. Okay, excellent. All right, so we'll keep it fairly high level then. If we want to, you can feel free to like raise your hand and maybe like wave wildly, gesture wildly, and I'll start to go into a little bit more detail. That way we can go as deep as we want. But we'll come back now to the beginning here and say deployment best practices. Like we talked about, there is a lot of context involved in choosing what a best practice will be for you and your organization. So if you're just getting started thinking about Kubernetes, or you're going down that route of saying, well, is this the right thing for me? Boy, this is going to be a fun ride for you today. We're going to give you 2 broad questions to ask yourself. What do my engineers know today? And then that second question is going to be, what does my organization need to be successful? These are 2 umbrella categories of questions that you want to ask yourself when you're choosing what strategy is right for you. If you're building that platform tooling on behalf of your internal customers, things that you want to be aware of are what kinds of infrastructure your teams are already using to deploy, what kinds of tooling they're comfortable with, and what their application stack looks like. That's going to give you a really good baseline to understand where your internal customers are at, right? Where your internal users are. Because if you don't at least meet them halfway, they're more than likely to find friction in the process. They're not going to get the benefit of adopting Kubernetes, right? And so you won't even get to the deployment part, right? They're just going to be confused and frustrated that you're asking them to do this thing. The other thing to be aware of is how closely coupled is that infrastructure to the application that you're deploying, right? So there's broadly several different categories of applications. There's stateless microservices, which Kubernetes is really, really good at deploying and managing. Stateful services, which Kubernetes has some answers for, but generally is a little bit less mature. And then a whole wide range of applications outside of that, like data-heavy applications, IoT-related things, although I don't know if you've seen this crazy series of blog posts from Chick-fil-A. They like deploy Kubernetes to their point-of-sale systems. That one's really cool. Not the standard by any means. And then you've got folks that are, just deploying to the edge. And we've seen this play out a million times, right? From my own experience working at a shoe retailer up in the Pacific Northwest, super famous. There were people that really knew Java and Spring well, and they didn't want to learn anything else, right? They were kind of like really excited about doing Java applications forever. They really liked their Jenkins builds for some reason. They didn't want to adopt this whole new strategy. And then there were other teams that were really on the bleeding edge. They wanted to adopt all the latest technologies. They wanted to GitOps all the things. And the challenge for the platform team there was to build or support a wide range of strategies that allowed folks to adopt the thing that fit their workflow best. So that brings us to the next part. It's one thing to understand who's going to be using your platform. It's another thing to understand what's going to make your organization successful. So some of the things that you want to keep in mind is what kind of security controls do you have in place? Are you in a place where you have to worry about SOC 2 compliance, FIPS, FedRAMP, any of these certifications that put constraints on what you can and can't do? That will definitely influence the way that you deploy to those clusters and the way that you allow your users to get their workloads into a place where they're serving, the needs of the business. Then you've got internal controls, right? Maybe there's a DevOps team that is providing pipeline tooling for you, or maybe there's another group that is providing a way for you to spin up a test harness, right? These are all things that you want to keep in mind when you're building out this deployment strategy so that you understand how those teams are successful, how you can be successful in turn. And then there's a whole wide range of personas that have nothing to do with Kubernetes itself, right? Those are your legal folks, those are your business analysts, your product owners, your PMs. They're all stakeholders in your deployment process. So when you're thinking about, should I use kubectl or should I use a tool that's a little bit more mature, provides a little bit more intelligence around those deployment tools, how am I going to be able to serve those personas as well? And I guarantee you, if you pay attention to them, it will pay dividends. They will love you, they will want to work with you more and make your life a lot easier. One of the other things you want to keep in mind with organizations is the pace of innovation, right? Did your CEO read Accelerate, or did they read the Phoenix project, and are they all excited about Dora Metrics or any of these other frameworks for creating consistent velocity around innovation, right? If that is the case, and even if it's not, and you're just in a high-functioning organization, you want to choose the strategy that's going to allow you to deploy as often as possible. And then the last one, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but how much money can you light on fire, right? Money solves a lot of problems. So if you have a lot of money to burn, then maybe buying a solution is better than trying to build a strategy internally. So we'll keep a lot of this stuff in mind as we go through some of these different strategies. One thing that is helpful for us to kind of evaluate some of these things is to consider this Gartner project that talks about Dora Metrics, right? Dora, thing that came out of Google some time ago. I think it actually came from the SRE book, if you've read the SRE book before. Definitely a good read. They've modified this over time, of course, right? But generally, the broad strokes of what you want to pay attention to here is how often can you deploy? How often can you, or how quickly can you recover from a failed deployment, right? Or to put it another way, how low can you drive the cost of a deployment and the cost of a mistake? And then some of the other things, let's see here. Let's see, deployment frequency, how long does it take to actually get there, right? So if you're deploying an application and it takes 10 minutes to deploy, right? You want to drive that down as fast as possible so you can drive down some of these other metrics. So we'll keep some of these in mind as we go through, but I'll just stop here and ask, can you reliably measure any of these things today? So for those of you who are building platform tooling or those of you who are in the space, can you reliably measure this with confidence? We have one nod. Excellent. If not, that's definitely a thing that we want to pay attention to. All right, so let's go a little bit further. Right now, let's get to the meat of what we want to talk about here. This is a grand Kubernetes adventure. So for those of you who did not raise your hand deploying production workloads to Kubernetes, this is where it's going to get really fun. There are a lot of different ways that this can go. and we're going to evaluate each of them in turn, right? So this is generally the progression that we see most often. Most folks who are just getting started will use kubectl or kubectl or any number of ways to pronounce this. I'll leave it up to you. I personally use kubectl, and that's just the command line client for Kubernetes, right? And what you can do with kubectl is you can take a YAML manifest and you can apply it to a cluster, and you can see your application stand up. Then you'll probably want to move on to something a little bit more complex from there, right? You'll probably want to automate some of this away. You don't necessarily want developers to be running kubectl on their local machine. You want there to be a little bit of structure so that that deployment process is repeatable. So at that point, you might choose to implement something like Argo, right? Argo is a Kubernetes controller that allows you to define a set application along with a couple other facts about what pieces of infrastructure within Kubernetes you want to assign to it, and then it'll be responsible for watching those resources, making sure that they exist in the state that you want. And then things might get a little bit more complex from there, right? Now you've got a repeatable deployment process, but maybe there's downtime in that deployment, right? Maybe your pods are not coming up fast enough, or maybe the load balancer that you've chosen is not routing traffic as fine-grained as you would want it to prevent downtime. Then you want to start mixing in more controllers into that Kubernetes system that will enable different kinds of deployments, right? So maybe you'll choose Argo Rollouts as another example, right? And that'll give you options around choosing blue-green or choosing progressive delivery or some other strategies, right? And then after that, you're going to say, well, I need a way to manage those tools, and I need a way to manage my applications, and I need to manage all the requests that are coming from my application development teams. I need a way to templatize this and scale it across my organization. I need to scale it across those 8,000 clusters that we were talking about, right? How do you do that if you're just running kubectl on your laptop? The short answer is you don't, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff in the ecosystem that have been built up over time to assist with some of this in a purely Kubernetes setting. And that's where you'll start leveraging templating tools and packaging tools like Helm and Customize. That's where you might choose something a little bit more robust like the open application model, and that's definitely something we could dive into in a bit. OAM is a pretty interesting, neat, recent development in the Kubernetes space that'll allow you to define some of the more complex approaches in the space. So I'm going to pause there and see, are we at the right level of abstraction? Are we familiar with controllers and Kubernetes operators? These are all good topics? Okay. And we're all roughly familiar with this progression here. Maybe there's some branches along the way. Excellent. Okay. So let's dive into this first one. Since it seems like we're pretty comfortable, we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about our grand adventure starting at kubectl. Chances are your team is going to be pretty small. You're not going to be doing anything too complicated. Deployment manifests are largely going to serve you well, right? And you can set a replica count that's not going to have your application totally run off the rails. And you can go on your merry way, right? We'll deploy a Pied Piper app by just having our developer apply kubectl to the cluster. Our next one is going to be kubectl with GitOps. So now we've introduced a controller into the cluster. The thing that we want to keep in mind here is that the complexity is increasing a little bit because we're now maintaining something within the cluster itself, right? Now it's no longer the Kubernetes API by itself that we're managing. Now we're managing some other component that's going to be helping us do deployments inside of the cluster. We're still maybe going to have a developer or two running kubectl at the command line, but largely what we can do now is we can commit to a repository and have that go into the cluster itself. And this is a little bit nicer because now you start to get a little bit of repetition in that process, right? You get practice, you get folks comfortable with the idea of deploying a large set of YAML manifests as a part of their deployment. And again, right at the end of the day, for I guess all the folks that are newer to Kubernetes, Kubernetes is just an API that abstracts compute for you. It's not necessarily going to do much more than that, right? So we do need some of these other tools in the cluster to extend that functionality, extend that API layer, so we're getting the things that we actually need out of our deployment process. So now things get a little bit more complicated, like we're talking about. We've got another controller that we're going to implement. In this case, we'll use Argo Rollouts as an example, right? And now you've got two controllers that you're paying attention to. And what we haven't talked about is the custom resources that exist underneath this. So we're extending the Kubernetes API with a whole bunch of new fields, a whole bunch of new strategies, right? More cognitive load for your developers to understand what's going on. So this is good when your team starts to grow and you need a way to quickly diffuse a lot of this deployment knowledge, right, without having them intimately aware of what's going on with the Kubernetes API, right? But this is kind of a double-edged sword, right? The more that you add onto this stack, the more that you add in terms of like admission controllers or any other sort of thing that is mutating the resources that are going into the cluster, the more places for things to go wrong and the less able your developers are going to be to debug that process, right? So your ability to educate the users that are going to be using this system at the end is basically a huge modulator on the success of this strategy. And then finally, we get to the very end of this strategy. Really, what we've been talking about so far is a single cluster, right? Like your developers are deploying into a single cluster. Maybe you found a way to stamp out Argo into different clusters, and you just apply that manifest across many different places. But really, eventually, you're going to want something that can orchestrate that across many different clusters. So this is where I'll rely on one of our customers that's been exploring this space, and it's actually quite interesting. They're considering something called the open application model, and that is an open spec that was defined, I believe, by the Crossplane community. Are folks familiar with Crossplane? Yeah? Okay, a little bit. Yeah, so Crossplane, this is ignoring a lot of nuance, but Crossplane is effectively a controller inside of Kubernetes that gives you Terraform-like abilities to basically declare infrastructure and have that controller created on your behalf. So they worked on this thing called the open application model. And what's really interesting about this approach is that it creates, it creates this notion that you have a set of artifacts that you want to deploy, a set of constraints, and then some environments that you want to take it to. So it's a lot easier for end users to describe, hey, this is my application. It's a jar, Java Spring microservice that's deployed inside of a container. I need it to be deployed to 5 different regions, right? And it really ups the level of abstraction there. You're no longer thinking about which namespace do I deploy to, or how many resources I need in a particular cluster. You're now all the way up at the level of describing resources that you need, right? Like I need, I don't know, I need access to a GPU, for example, and I need it to be in these 5 regions, and my workload needs direct access to, a particular database. These are all things that you can describe, and it's very flexible, but now you need a platform engineering team on the back end that can implement a lot of those descriptions. OAM by itself is not going to allow you to deploy to 5 different regions, right? It doesn't really have that notion. It just gives you a way to describe it. And then that platform engineering team implements what it means to go to 5 different regions, right? And what authentication is needed, what infrastructure is needed to make that possible. So at every point in time, you're making trade-offs between what you need and what is going to make your organization successful. So let's pause there and let's see, are there questions so far about any of the different strategies that we've talked about? Is the Flutter chat still saying welcome? Oh, gotcha. Okay. Sounds good. All right. So let's tell you a little bit about the bet that we're making in the Kubernetes space, right? Like I said, we've talked to customers that are deploying to thousands of clusters, customers that have a DevOps team of 1, right? Which is usually just like an engineer on the team. And universally, what we've heard is that folks, as they scale the size of their organization, struggle to scale the level of education of their end users, right? They've got a whole bunch of application developers that are really knowledgeable about their domain, but this is not a part of that domain, right? Ultimately, what they want is the ability to deploy their application quickly. They don't necessarily want to think about it. They have some idea of what they need, right? They have some idea of, for example, those users that need access to a GPU, but they don't necessarily want to understand the platform underneath. And now I'm no Kelsey Hightower, but I really like an analogy that he's used in the past. You've bought a plot of land and you're building a home. And the builder comes over and wants to talk to you about the hammer and the screwdriver and all these other tools that he's got, right? And how he's going to build the house. And at the end of the day, you probably don't care too much about the tools that he's using as long as the house is built correctly. So that's what we're trying to do, right? That's a lot of the tooling that we're starting to build is we don't want you to have to go to your developers and say, Here are the 16 different CRDs that you have to be familiar with to deploy your application. Here is the platform that you'll use. And of course, we started as a company that was really developing open source Spinnaker, right? And I know Joel is, but are folks familiar with Spinnaker as a platform? Yeah, a little bit. So for those of you that are less familiar, Spinnaker is an open source platform for doing continuous delivery, originally started by Netflix in oh gosh, I'm not going to say a date because I don't know it confidently offhand. Mid-2010s, how about that? Yeah. And they were really at the forefront of defining what continuous delivery is, right? And so that's how we got our start, right? We got our start contributing to that community, building enterprise functionality on top, and now we're taking the lessons learned from that and building a software as a service solution to solve a lot of the problems that we've been talking about today. So really what we focus on is, instead of, again, these set of 16 CRDs, giving you a simple YAML format, again, YAML, right? But that seems to be the going standard these days. And giving you the ability to define that once for your application and then have it go to all the different environments that we have. And it's very similar to that open application model where we don't ask you for the exact pipeline that you need to execute to deploy to all these environments. We're not asking you all of the different pieces of configuration or authentication to deploy to X or Y Kubernetes cluster. It's just focusing on 3 pieces of information, right? What are the artifacts that you're deploying? Where are they going to? Which environments? And then what's the relationships between those environments, right? What's the difference between your staging and your production environment? Chances are it just comes down to resources, right, in most cases. But you probably don't want to go automatically from one environment to another unless you got a lot of confidence in that deployment. So define a constraint that says, you know, if I want to go between these 2 environments, I need a human in the loop. Click that button, say yes, let's go to production, right? So with that, I'll just show you a brief view of how that looks in the UI. And let's see, I noticed there's a TV up there. I don't think my eyes are good enough to see it. Yeah, so I might just have to do it this way here. And I'm sorry, I'm going to turn my back to the camera here for a moment and just talk a little bit about what this ends up looking like. What we've built is something that's API first. So anything that you can do in the UI that you're seeing right now, you can do through a command line. You can do it by sending an API call. I'm actually going to dump out to the home screen here and just show you. We've got a whole bunch of, I'm going to switch my tenant here real quick to internal production so I can show you some actual stuff that we've been deploying, that we've been using internally. And so what you can see is just a list of deployments that have been successful over the last little bit of time. What you can see is that we've defined 2 different environments. We're going to go ahead and progressively roll out to those 2 environments. We'll give you an ability to visually see the different environments that you have. So in this case, this deployment's already done. You can see we're going, hey, we're going to staging, we're going to production. Let's go look at staging real quick. And you can see a lot more detail about not only the resources that are being deployed, in this case, the service and an ingress, but also the service itself. What image was being deployed. So this was some image that was built, I don't know, 12 days ago, roughly. And then where it exists in its state of deployment. So of course, if we were running this deployment right now, we could see it kind of balancing traffic between the 2 of them. And everything that is powering this UI right now was defined very simply with this YAML file right here. So again, this will look very familiar to folks that have been using Kubernetes YAML documents for the better part of the last 6-7 years. Longer if you're one of those early Kubernetes adopters. So again, we have a very simple set of resources or pieces of information that we need. Here's that artifact, right? These are the things that you want to tell us to deploy. These are the environments. And then we kind of split that notion of constraints between environments and relationships between environments with either our constraint section here, or you can define a strategy down here. You can define strategies in any way you want, really. We support blue-green, progressive rollout, and also a couple other pieces that integrate much nicer with like Istio, and then there's like a service mesh protocol on top of that. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. But we can see here a very simple way to describe the application that you want, where you want it to go, and you're not having to wire up a whole bunch of different pipeline stages to get to that point. Yeah, just to show you back to our little architecture diagram here, kind of how this looks. we've got a notion of the seed.sui that we've been looking at, and then the way that this actually rolls out is through a remote network agent. So this is an agent that just runs in the cluster and is able to communicate according to the permissions that you give the agent, right? So if you only want it to deploy to a certain namespace, you can scope the permissions for that agent. It'll only know how to talk to that specific namespace. And then with the knowledge that we have of these different Kubernetes clusters, we can do that environment promotion for you automatically. So if you're curious about checking out the architecture in a little bit more detail, certainly feel free to do that. We're going to do our little presenter view again here. And then let's see. Oh yeah, we've got folks that are excited about it. Easy to automate, very simple. You can check these out if you like. But really, I want to open it up at this point, see if there's questions around deployment strategy, around, I guess, the different tools that you can be using in the space and kind of what you want to think about with the customers that you're building that platform tooling for.
When it comes to, like, I guess, rollouts, you briefly touched on it. What does CD as a service kind of do in that space? Like, so for example, you canaries and blue-green and stuff like that. Is that kind of all built into the platform, or is it something you have to tool yourself or in stages?
Nope, it's pretty much all defined for you. I'll repeat the question. So what does, or what's the relationship between rollouts and then the CD as a service tool? So rollouts is a controller that you'll run inside of the cluster, extends the Kubernetes API natively, and gives you all those strategies for you to define in those custom resources in cluster. And what we do is build it into the SaaS platform itself. The RNA is not actually very intelligent on its own. All it is a pass-through for the API commands that we want to send to the Kubernetes API ourselves. So we implement all of that stuff for you, and then just have you define that, again, in that YAML file that says, hey, I want a blue-green deployment. Maybe you want that for your production environment, but for staging, it's not so important to have that blue-green. You could just say, roll it out. If there's downtime, that's okay. But that's primarily the difference there.
And I know you briefly touched on like the templating there. How much can you truly abstract away from like the engineer? So, the guardrails, not gates, make it simple to be wrong kind of mentality. Is there a way for me just to automatically kind of say, hey, I have an app and I want it to stage and prod and give me my safe defaults? Is there a way of doing that within that, or do you have to really specify all that? And kind of, have you seen any strategies around that for the CD as a service?
Let me see if I understand the question. So you're asking if there are guardrails in place for you to specify, hey, I only want to allow my users to define like X and Y strategies. Yeah. Not currently. Yeah, that's something you'd probably want to build a little bit of tooling around yourself. And if you wanted to do that in a Kubernetes native way, you'd probably end up choosing something like Customizer Helm and then building guardrails around that way. Yeah.
So you're extending like the YAML and then into that kind of world. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't know if there was like a built-in,
No, not yet. Yeah, we're pretty early days. We're super excited about it. It's definitely not as mature as something like Spinnaker. One thing I didn't mention is that we primarily focus on Kubernetes deployments right now with this service, and that's of course the focus that we've been talking about today. But there are definitely more mature solutions that will do, like cross-cloud or cross-environment deployments for you. Spinnaker being one of them. Yeah. Question here?
I know you said you're kind of newer in this space. I'm curious if you've identified like what are some traits of customers that you've worked with where things have gone really smoothly and really well, and conversely ones where it's been more difficult.
Yeah, excellent question. We have talked about in the past. I don't think it's on the website anymore, but there's like a customer maturity model, right? On the far left end of the spectrum, you have customers that are deploying into a traditional data center. They're doing everything manually. They've got bash scripts. They've got a whole, coterie of things that they're doing to do deployments. And then on the other end of the spectrum entirely are people that have fully automated deployments. They're doing things like canary analysis to determine at a very deep level whether the application they deployed is healthy. And you can cluster a lot of our customers as kind of like a bell curve, right? Most everybody is somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, and then we've got a few customers on the far end that are like way ahead of everybody else, years ahead, and then you've got customers that are a little bit lagging behind. And usually what ends up being the biggest indicator of success is how well the platform team is able to evangelize internally. It's almost never a technology problem. It's almost always a people and process problem, right? It's like, how well does that platform team understand the needs of the people that they're serving, and how can they adapt the tooling to serve them, right? So we go back to that example of Pacific Northwest Shoe Company, Java Spring developers that don't care about deployments. You probably want to give them something that just says, here's my jar and here's the environment, right? But the development teams that are all into GitOps, are all into Kubernetes, want to be deploying, want to be like trying all the new stuff out, make sure that the solution you build out is flexible enough for them to do that on their own, right? Don't take that burden on yourself as a platform team. Just say, here is the set of tools that you have available, and if you want to go beyond what we can support right now, go do that. And that, again, is usually not a technology problem. It's always like how willing the platform team is able and willing to go that far to kind of support the internal customers that they have. Any other questions?
I guess you've seen, you obviously worked with many customers, not naming names, but like, what are some strategies to, a lot of folks on the call may be in a org that isn't where they want it to be. They want to get there. What are some strategies, like, so CD as a service, the tool is great, but like you said, evangelizing the tool inside the organization. What are some things that you've seen take off, like demo days, or just, again, it's more of a soft question.
No, totally.
It's a general platform engineering question.
Yeah.
Adopted in an organization.
Definitely. So the question, if I understood it right, is how to evangelize effectively within your organization. Yeah. There's a whole, wow, this is a deep talk too. We could spend like another 30 minutes here as well. But I think the short of it is, how easy is it for your end users to discover what your platform does and how it can benefit them? So that can start as simply as writing down documentation, like one-pagers that you can share with individual teams. It could be embedding with a team. That was one strategy that was successful for us around like 2014, 2015, was just like embedding with engineering teams and saying, hey, we're going to help set this up for you. We're going to teach somebody else on your team how to do it. And then, you can come back to us with questions, when you need help, or, when we've got a new feature or something. And then depending on the size of the organization, it could be interesting to implement something called inner source. Is that a term that's familiar to folks? Inner source? Sorta, yeah. So for the folks that are less familiar, inner source is basically taking the practices and processes that have been super successful running large open source projects inside of a larger corporation, right? So rather than having like directors talk to each other at a high level about what they need, you have engineers talking to each other about what they need, and it's easier to unearth requirements and see what your internal customers are struggling with your platform. So you can do these things like communities of practice, right? Basically like a version of what we're doing right now, but inside of a company. Usually, as long as you find like one or two executive sponsors, it's fairly straightforward to continue building momentum there. And there's like a whole bunch of tooling now, I think, on the Inner Source Commons website that you can use to kind of like kickstart that within your organization. Yeah, I'm passionate about that. So yeah, we could spend like another 30 minutes talking about it.
Sorry. We personally find that a lot. Like, that's how we find success.
Yeah.
It's like the idea of like common templates that, like, hey, the Helm templates that your deployments use are obviously have to be peer reviewed. You can't just change those. But like, you can say, hey, we want to be able to customize the replica count. Let's say that wasn't a customizable feature.
Right.
But then you expose that after commentary in a public discourse, kind of open source way.
Right.
You merge that in, and then everyone wins from that feature.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, if you've got more questions, we'll hang around. I'll be around for a little while longer, and then I suppose if there are questions online, we can figure out a way to get in touch.
Yeah.
But otherwise, thank you all for having me. It's been fun, and hope you have a great rest of your evening.
So yeah, we'll probably keep the live chat open for another 9 or so minutes. But if there's anything in specific you have a question on, or just want to just generally chat about, we're here for you. And thank you, Fernando, for coming and presenting the content today. It was awesome. So thank you. Cool.